It's the year 2000, and the video game industry is changing rapidly. The PlayStation 2 is set to be released in December of this year, and the Sega Dreamcast has already set the bar of what is expected from the next generation of consoles. Video games were starting to look less like whatever the fuck this is, and a lot more like something you'd see in real life. But while the hype for the next gen is real, the surviving 5th generation consoles, the PlayStation and the N64, are still in need of good software. One such game, Medal of Honor for the PlayStation, had been released in the fall of the previous year. It was essentially a GoldenEye 64 clone for the PlayStation that had tight level design, fantastic sound and music, and most importantly, it was a lot of fun. Its publisher, Electronic Arts, had greenlit a sequel for Medal of Honor almost immediately once it became clear that the IP was going to go somewhere, and even bought its development studio outright. Its developer, DreamWorks Interactive, had to ask itself a question: how do we follow up a game as good as Medal of Honor, and make it better?
May I see your papers, please?
For Medal of Honor's sequel, the team decided not to reinvent the wheel, but rather flesh out the existing in-game characters and expand upon its universe. Producer Peter Hirschman decided to bring back Manon Baptiste for the sequel, who was the protagonist boss in the first game, but this time, she would be the main character. Manon was loosely based on the real-life French resistance fighter Hélène Deschamps Adams, who was a badass spy who really threw a wrench in the German war machine in occupied France during the 1940s. However, it should be noted that the real-life Hélène Deschamps Adams was less of a female Rambo and more of a Shoshana from Inglourious Basterds, using wit, cunning, and her female charms to subvert the Nazis rather than by using brute force. However, Medal of Honor Underground at its core was still a video game, and certain liberties had to be taken to ensure that the experience would be fun. Even so, it took a bit of convincing for EA to warm up to the idea of a female protagonist, but cooler heads eventually prevailed, and DreamWorks Interactive could begin realizing their vision. With their proposal greenlit, DWI had to figure out how to improve upon the original Medal of Honor's gameplay. This would not be an easy task for a variety of reasons. DreamWorks Interactive was still using the same engine from Jurassic Park: The Lost World from 1997, and the engine was definitely showing its age by the year 2000. The original PlayStation itself was a pretty weedy machine 6 years after its debut, and was constantly plagued with memory constraints. Also, a lot of the team that worked on the original were diverted to work on the upcoming PS2 Medal of Honor, which would eventually come to be known as Medal of Honor Frontline. To compound that lack of manpower, according to producer Scott J. Langto, the timetable to finish Medal of Honor Underground was much shorter than the originals, forcing the team to work grueling hours and often sleep at their desks towards the end of development. Despite all this, upon its release, Medal of Honor Underground had mostly met expectations, and was a worthy successor to the original breakout hit. In fact, I would go as far to say that Medal of Honor Underground is perhaps the best console first-person shooter from that entire generation. And now I'm gonna tell you why. Number 1. Playability. I think a lot of people strap on the nostalgia goggles and gravely overstate how good many of these early 3D games actually are. Now, make no mistake, there were a lot of great 3D games for the 5th generation of consoles, but for every one that aged well, there are 5 that aged like dick cheese on a hot summer day. One such game, and this is going to be controversial to some, is GoldenEye 64. Oh my fucking god, this game is unplayable in 2019. Whether I'm fighting the sluggish controls, squinching through the blur vision graphics, watching the frame rate in AI pathfinding commit suicide, or suffering through the worst escort mission of all time, I can't help but feel that GoldenEye represents some of the absolute worst of 90s console game design. However, Medal of Honor Underground, despite being heavily influenced by the mission design of GoldenEye, largely avoids the playability pitfalls of its inspiration. One of the aspects of Underground that has aged surprisingly well is its controls. The default control scheme that was designed for the D-pad is only serviceable, but an option for full analog control exists within the options menu, and is almost indistinguishable from modern FPS controls. Not only was this one of the only console games from this entire generation that used dual-stick aiming and strafing, but the controls are actually pretty good, and allow for an impressive degree of precision when aiming for specific body parts. This is crucial because the gameplay of Underground relies heavily on aimed shots rather than running and gunning like other first-person shooters. Aiding the great controls is the truly excellent feedback the player is given for both giving and receiving damage. Bullets impacting flesh are orally represented by an extremely loud sound that leaves zero doubt that the player has either given or received damage. Additionally, when an enemy is hit, he will tend to briefly freeze and visibly show pain and discomfort from getting shot, which is visible even in Underground's low-poly models. All of these factors combined give Underground undeniably solid gunplay that is still fun 2 decades after release, which isn't something that can be said about a lot of games from this era. Underground was also pretty good about telegraphing enemy attacks to the player. Enemies have long wind-up animations for throwing and kicking back grenades. Troops with rocket launchers have to retreat to a safe distance and kneel before firing a giant, slow, light source projectile that you'd have to be blind to miss. They even have to pause to reload from time to time. Because you almost always know how an enemy is feeling or what they plan to do based on their animations, the potential frustration factor is cut down by a huge amount. But we can't talk about the animation of Underground without also talking about number 2, the graphics and art design. Whereas the original Medal of Honor had a pretty consistent gray, blue-green styling to it, Medal of Honor Underground's art design varies heavily based on the geography of the mission you're in. From the streets of France, to the ruins of Knossos, to the cliffsides of Italy, every level looks distinct and dignified in its own way. Combined with the high-quality texture work and high-polygon environments, Medal of Honor Underground looks head over heels better than most games of this era. However, a lot had to be sacrificed to achieve this level of visual fidelity. For Underground, DreamWorks Interactive relied heavily on the tried-and-true technique of rendering as little as fucking possible. Tall trees have canopies that seem to fade into the ether when you look up, and the Eiffel Tower disappears only a few meters into the air. Of course, the most obvious issue with this game's graphics is the absolutely fucking pathetic draw distance. While undeniably improved over the original game, in Underground you can only see about 40 meters ahead of you before the level geometry and enemies fade into the black. You'll eventually get used to it, but it's definitely pretty distracting. But while Underground looks undeniably dated by today's standards, I'd argue the art design and interesting use of color still hold up nearly 20 years later. Number 3, the gameplay. Because much of Underground's development occurred at the same time as the more important PS2 sequel, DreamWorks Interactive didn't have a lot of oversight from either EA or Spielberg, so they were able to pretty much go crazy with new ideas. While most of the original Medal of Honor was spent
killing Nazis
and occasionally sneaking around in disguise, Underground is constantly hitting you with new gameplay mechanics and enemies throughout the game.
Hello, beautiful. How about this one?
For the first time in the series, you can fight alongside friendly AI fighters, and there's even a mission where 2 different factions fight each other. Also introduced in Underground are enemy vehicles that Manon has to destroy. Tanks, half-tracks, motorcycles, trucks, and even planes are all actively trying to fuck your shit up, and they all put up a good fight or otherwise provide a unique challenge to overcome. Halfway through the game, the developers completely stop giving a shit about historical accuracy, and you'll find yourself in some creepy castle fighting against SS soldiers in literal suits of armor who charge at you with a sword. Medal of Honor Underground was also perhaps the first FPS ever to feature a rail shooting segment, and boy oh boy what a segment it is. It's basically Mr. Toad's Wild Ride if Mr. Toad decided to shove cocaine up his asshole. On this batshit downhill motorcycle ride, you blast away at Germans who have no concern for their own lives or safety. At some point you realize the best way to beat this level is to just blindly shoot into the void like... But we can't talk about insane level design without also mentioning Underground's infamous bonus mission, Panzerkanaka Unleashed. Essentially, at the end of the original Medal of Honor's development, an entire level called Kolditz Castle had to be cut to meet deadline. Virtually all of the in-game assets were already done, but there just wasn't enough time to cram it into the game. Not wanting all of the team's hard work to go to waste, lead designer Lynn Henson told Scott Langto about the plan to convert the unused level into a wacky bonus mission. While initially skeptical, given that Underground was to ship in 2 months, Langto eventually warmed up to the idea when he realized that Henson was serious. Eventually, several other people at DWI would join in, and the result was the truly weird Panzerkanaka Unleashed.
Ich bin der Panzerknacker!
In Panzerkanaka Unleashed, the player resumes the role of protagonist Jimmy Patterson from the first game, who infiltrates a castle run by a crazy Nazi scientist after the OSS receives a distressed radio transmission. Things get really weird really fast, and Jimmy finds himself fighting a truly strange host of enemies as he searches the castle for body parts for the mystical Panzerkanaka robot. The real-life Panzerkanaka was a weirdly cutesy cartoon drawing of a red nutcracker, used as the cover of a 1940s anti-tank manual for the German military. In the final level of the bonus mission, Jimmy assembles his very own, and together they fight their way out of the castle. I've gotta say, watching sentient nutcrackers get into a protracted firefight with each other is some of the goofiest shit I've ever seen in a video game, and I'm totally here for it. All in all, Panzerkanaka Unleashed perfectly rounds out an already extremely varied shooter, and displays the absolute height of the series' creativity. Well, there you have it. Medal of Honor Underground, in my opinion, still holds up in 2019. When you combine the fantastic level design, smart and challenging enemies, great variety, fun gameplay mechanics, and amazing music, Medal of Honor Underground truly stands out as one of the best shooters of the era. It certainly isn't perfect, but despite its flaws and limitations, Underground is still playable and fun even today. I think it's pretty depressing that no one ever seems to talk about this game anymore, especially considering it's one of the absolute best games in the entire World War II shooter genre. But for those of us who've played it, Medal of Honor Underground remains a classic that will never be forgotten. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Gio Echidna, signing off.
Amateur.